30-year-old Christopher Lee Cunn was having a great day out on the boat with his family and his best friend Robert, just off the port in St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, Christopher and Robert would use the boat and look down from it into the water and search for these rock piles, and when they would find one, they would throw on their scuba tanks, hop in, and attempt to find these lobsters. Near the end of the day, they were looking into the water and saw what they thought to be was another rock pile at first, but then they really examined it and realized it had these streaks or lines running down it, and they thought, okay, this must be an underwater building. Robert noticed this yellow buoy floating on the surface right above whatever this was in the water. They thought about going over to read it, but then they thought, it's fine. Why read the buoy oddly floating directly above this strange structure? What is the worst thing that can happen? Well, it turns out if they had used their brains and read what was on the buoy, they would have seen a big warning on it that said to stay clear at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Christopher didn't even bother to check. So they throw on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. And after sinking only about 10 feet into the water, they noticed there wasn't just one structure. There was actually 3 huge structures. So Chris and Robert looked at each other and they are just amazed at what they are looking at. They had been scuba diving since they were kids, and they had spent so much time in these waters, and they had never seen these before, these massive underwater buildings. So they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and right up next to one of the structures, Chris noticed it was a large concrete box, and on each of the walls near the top, there was almost like these windows, these large gaps, but behind each gap there was this wire mesh blocking anything from going in. Chris and Robert pushed their faces up against this wire to try and get a view inside, but it was too dark to see anything, so Chris was bummed out, as he was really pumped. He wanted to see something cool. So he just grabs the mesh and just yanks it off, and surprisingly, it easily just comes right off. Chris and Robert turn to one another, and they nod. Then they travel into the darkness, Chris in the lead, with Robert close behind him. And they would find themselves in this huge empty room that's at least 70 feet by 70 feet. Mind you, this room had absolutely nothing in it, except for at the very bottom. On one of the walls, there was this 16-foot round opening that happened to be the entrance to this huge tunnel. And from where Chris and Robert were, they could not see down into the tunnel. So again, they turned to one another, nodded, and went down to check out this opening to the tunnel. So Chris lowers himself first, then Robert, and as they both get down, they start to feel this current start to pull them down. And the second either of them felt the current, they knew they made a massive mistake. They tried swimming as hard as they could, up and towards the exit. Robert, because he was higher up than Chris, was actually able to escape the current and get to where they entered. But Chris was not so lucky. The current was so strong, it ripped him backwards, and he goes tumbling down into the pitch black tunnel. And Robert watches it all happen. And he can't do anything about it. So all he does, after seeing his friend get sucked down this black tunnel, is turn around, go up to the surface, and call for 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he begins to tumble backwards so uncontrollably. The current was so strong that his face mask and his mouthpiece almost get ripped from him. So he instinctively grabs on and holds on to them for dear life. As he was tumbling, it dawned on Chris that at some moment he was going to meet whatever it was that was creating this current, whether it was a massive pump or massive spinning turbines. He just didn't know. So in that moment, Chris actually considered pulling out his mouthpiece and choosing to drown instead of whatever horrible fate he would have seen. But then he started to think of his family and his friends, and he just couldn't do it. So he braves the storm and decides to wait it out. After about 5 minutes of this hell, he sees a tiny speck of light, and he's being brought in the direction of the light in the far end of the tunnel, and he thinks, alright, this is it, I'm about to die. But as he got closer and closer to the light, he's finally expecting death, but instead, he's shot out into this pool of calm water with light all around. He immediately swims towards the surface and realizes that he was actually inside of a huge building, floating in this massive reservoir of water. And there were people walking around with clipboards and hard hats, and he was confused as ever. And he just gets up, gets out of the water, and he starts to scream for help. It would turn out Chris was actually sucked into a power plant, a nuclear power plant. And this power plant in particular used a system where the water sucked into the plant would be used to cool the reactor, but this very specific one used a system where the water sucked in went into this pool before being sucked into another room, which most likely had turbines or some sort of pump. And he most certainly would have died if this was any other type of nuclear power plant. Chris would actually go on to try and sue the power plant, saying the reason this happened was because there was no danger or warning signs and it could have been entirely avoided. The power plant argued back that the buoy and the wire mesh were there for a reason, and Christopher Lee Kun was proven at fault for his own injuries and the whole experience and trauma he got for getting sucked into a power plant. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. We upload every other day. This has been Howard Horror, and as usual, have a great day.